Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. These simple gestures help us track the moment, but they do not and cannot protect us from what is about to unfold. Tonight's investigation concerns not a creature nor a cult, but a symbol, a glyph so conceptually potent that to witness it is to unravel. It is known only as the yellow sign, and those who see it often come to wish they had not. First appearing in Robert W. Chambers' 1895 collection, The King in Yellow, the sign is never described directly, yet it acts with surgical precision, destabilizing perception, collapsing reality, and marking the viewer for metaphysical erasure. Chambers, an artist-turned-author writing in the shadow of Poe and the twilight of the 19th century, crafted a work of fiction that behaves less like a narrative and more like a contagion. Though largely forgotten in his lifetime, The King in Yellow would go on to infect the writings of Lovecraft, Ligotti, and countless others, its pages whispering not a story, but a question. What if meaning itself could become malignant? Across 4 parts, we will trace the yellow sign's origins, decode its symbolic gravity, follow its recursive spread through fiction, and chart its unsettling afterlife in contemporary culture. Consider carefully, if the sign is not real, why do those who study it report feeling marked? Whether symbol, artifact, or conceptual virus, the yellow sign leaves behind not belief, but residue. Robert W. Chambers was not born a horror writer. Before he became the architect of one of literature's most enigmatic symbols, the yellow sign, he was a painter, trained in the rigorous realism of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. This training, steeped in academic technique and aesthetic idealism, would later fracture into something darker. It is said that Chambers' years in Paris during the 1880s exposed him to the symbolist movement, whose preoccupation with forbidden beauty and hidden meanings would infect his prose. When The King in Yellow appeared in 1895, it was written not by a mystic, but by an artist who had lost faith in art's promise. The book is less a horror anthology than an autopsy of the aesthetic age, written at the moment when beauty itself began to look pathological. We must recognize that Chambers did not set out to create a mythos. He set out to capture the feeling that art, once transcendent, had turned poisonous. The fin de siècle literary landscape into which The King in Yellow emerged was already vibrating with anxiety. The decadence, Huysmans, Wilde, and Baudelaire had turned art into a sanctuary for sickness, where beauty and decay were twins. In this milieu, the color yellow was already coded as a sign of aesthetic corruption. The cover of the Yellow Book, 1894, had become synonymous with scandal, particularly after Wilde's arrest the following year. Chambers' choice of title was therefore deliberate, positioning his work in conversation with the aestheticism that was, by then, devouring itself. But unlike his contemporaries, Chambers weaponized symbolism itself. He took the decadent motif, the beautiful book that ruins its reader, and transformed it into something metaphysical. His yellow sign was not merely a symbol of decadence, it was the agent of it. This reveals something profound. Chambers was not parodying the age's sickness, he was distilling it into form. Chambers' background as a visual artist explains much of his narrative method. His descriptions are often static, tableau-like, and laden with visual atmosphere rather than plot progression. He paints through words, using contrast, light against decay, color against absence, to evoke the sensory corruption of the soul. In The King in Yellow, this painterly impulse curdles into horror. The yellow sign, never described directly, functions like negative space on a canvas. Its absence becomes presence. This restraint mirrors symbolist techniques where meaning is achieved through omission, not revelation. Consider this carefully. The sign's terror arises from Chambers' refusal to define it. In doing so, he externalized a fundamental artistic paradox of the 1890s, the realization that meaning itself was dissolving, that symbols had become autonomous. The artist no longer controlled the image controlled the artist. We must pause here to note how thoroughly The King in Yellow reflects its historical moment's obsession with madness as both disease and enlightenment. The 1890s were the decade of Charcot's lectures on hysteria, of Freud's early studies on dream and repression, of public fascination with the porous boundary between sanity and vision. Chambers' characters, artists, scholars, and dreamers inhabit precisely this unstable threshold. They are not mad in the Gothic sense. They are aware. Their madness is intellectual, almost spiritual, a product of seeing too clearly. In this way, Chambers anticipates Lovecraft's later notion of cosmic horror, in which the revelation of truth is indistinguishable from psychological collapse. Yet where Lovecraft's horror is cold and impersonal, Chambers is intimate. The yellow sign destroys not through vastness, but through seduction. The intent behind The King in Yellow has long been debated. Was Chambers crafting allegory, parody, or prophecy? The ambiguity is deliberate. On one level, the work reads as decadent satire, a critique of artists who worship art beyond sanity. On another, it functions as a metaphysical thought experiment. What if meaning itself became contagious? What if a play or a symbol could act as an epistemological virus? Chambers' refusal to anchor his symbol in theology or science leaves the sign floating in semantic limbo, simultaneously artistic and supernatural. This liminality is the source of its power. It cannot be interpreted through one framework because it infects all frameworks. In that sense, Chambers was less storyteller than philosopher of collapse. His fiction was the laboratory where semiotics began to rot. In 1895, the same year The King in Yellow was published, Europe was on the brink of what would soon be called modernism, a cultural movement defined by fragmentation, disillusionment, and the collapse of stable meaning. Chambers' work anticipates this by at least 2 decades. The yellow sign operates as both symptom and prophecy of this condition. It represents the moment when art ceases to represent the world and begins instead to consume it. That is why Chambers' later career, devoted to historical romances and popular adventure tales, feels almost like self-erasure. Having glimpsed the abyss, he turned away. But the sign remained. It passed quietly into the imaginations of Lovecraft, Derleth, and later Ligotti, carrying with it the original infection, the suspicion that beauty and knowledge are merely the early symptoms of madness. The yellow sign is not an isolated creation of Chambers' imagination. It is the inheritor of an ancient lineage of ideas that stretches from mystical theology to modern nihilism. Every forbidden sigil, every ineffable word, and every unseeable truth in Western thought precedes it. To understand why the yellow sign destroys those who see it, we must examine the philosophical and cultural traditions that made such a concept intelligible. Chambers, though not a philosopher in the academic sense, was writing at the confluence of 3 streams: the decadent aesthetic of late 19th century Europe, the occult revival of its esoteric underground, and the philosophical pessimism that defined its intellectual horizon. The sign is born from the collision of these worlds, art, magic, and despair, each already infected by the belief that knowledge might kill. The decadent movement provided the immediate cultural soil in which Chambers' ideas could germinate. Writers like Huysmans, Wilde, and Verlaine treated beauty as both ecstasy and poison, and their obsession with the artificial mirrored the yellow sign's allure. Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1890, turned aesthetic perfection into damnation, while Hyman's A Rebours, 1884, depicted art as the means by which reality could be denied. Chambers absorbed this logic but stripped it of irony. His sign is not symbolic of corruption. It is corruption, functioning as the terminal endpoint of the decadent aesthetic. In a world where beauty and sickness were indistinguishable, Chambers offered a symbol that enforced their equivalence. It is not an artistic motif. It is an epistemological verdict. The decadence flirted with madness. Chambers systematized it into metaphysics. Yet beneath this artistic despair lies the influence of occult and mystical traditions that treated symbols as living entities. The late 19th century saw a fervent revival of Hermeticism, Theosophy, and Rosicrucian thought, all of which posited that certain signs or words carried inherent spiritual force. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, and Eliphas Levi's writings on magical alphabets insisted that the universe itself was structured by hidden correspondences, geometries of meaning only the initiated could perceive. Chambers, likely familiar with such ideas through Parisian symbolist circles, inverted their premise. In his world, the ultimate correspondence leads not to enlightenment, but to collapse. The yellow sign is the anti-tetragrammaton, a mark whose power lies not in its ability to reveal divinity, but in its capacity to demonstrate that divinity never existed. Where mystics sought union with the cosmos, Chambers' symbol offers only assimilation into entropy. We must pause here to consider another precursor, the linguistic philosophy of ineffability that permeated both theology and early modern thought. Medieval mystics such as Meister Eckhart and the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing spoke of divine truth as that which could only be approached through negation, language as ladder to be destroyed once ascension was complete. In this lineage, the yellow sign functions as a parody of mystical ascent. It does not grant vision through unknowing. It annihilates the distinction between knowledge and ignorance altogether. The initiate who perceives it does not transcend meaning. He watches meaning implode. In this way, Chambers' symbol performs what apophatic mystics only theorized, the self's dissolution upon contact with absolute reality. It is not salvation through unknowing, it is extinction through recognition. Philosophically, Chambers' period was dominated by the pessimism of Arthur Schopenhauer and the emerging existential despair of Nietzsche. Both thinkers eroded the metaphysical scaffolding that had sustained Western culture for centuries. Schopenhauer's vision of blind, purposeless will found new expression in the despairing beauty of the decadence, while Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God left humanity suspended in meaninglessness. The yellow sign, though fictional, embodies this intellectual crisis. It is the symbol of a universe that has become self-aware and found nothing at its center. We must recognize that Chambers' innovation lies in aestheticizing this despair. Rather than express nihilism through argument, he encoded it into a visual impossibility, a symbol whose mere sight conveys metaphysical futility. In this sense, the yellow sign anticipates what modern philosophers would call epistemic trauma, the collapse of knowledge's ability to orient the self in reality. There is also an older, folkloric undercurrent at play, the myth of the forbidden mark. From the biblical tale of the serpent's promise, "Your eyes shall be opened," to the alchemist's sigil that summons what cannot be dismissed, the idea of an image that carries consequence is ancient. The medieval devils, mark, the witch's unholy seal, the geomantic talismans of grimoires, all belong to this lineage. But Chambers' sign is different in one crucial aspect. It has no function. It is not a key, nor a curse, nor a defense. It is pure signifier detached from meaning. In linguistic terms, it represents the total severance of sign and referent, the ultimate anxiety of modernity, that words no longer point to truth, only to themselves. Here we glimpse the philosophical radicalism of Chambers' design. He created a symbol that signifies nothing, and in doing so, he gave nothingness a symbol. The implications of this synthesis, decadent art, occult mysticism, and philosophical nihilism, extend beyond literary history. The yellow sign emerges as the perfect product of a culture that had exhausted its faith in both reason and revelation. It functions as an aesthetic fossil, preserving the moment when art ceased to reflect the world and began instead to consume it. Chambers' work thus foreshadows Lovecraft's own materialist despair, but with a difference. Lovecraft's horror stems from the cosmos' indifference, Chambers from its intelligibility. The sign does not show that the universe is meaningless. It shows that it is too meaningful, that every atom has been inscribed, every thought predetermined, every symbol already decoded. The yellow sign resists description, not because it is shapeless, but because it is designed to operate beyond language, to exceed, distort, and ultimately erase the structures of signification through which we normally understand meaning. Robert W. Chambers never defines the sign visually, and yet readers across generations speak of it as though they have seen it. This paradox is not a flaw in the text, but the very mechanism of its power. The sign functions semiotically, not representationally. It acts as what Jacques Lacan would later call a pure signifier, a symbol that does not refer outwardly to an object, but inwardly to a rupture in the symbolic order itself. In short, the yellow sign is a linguistic trap. It names the breakdown of naming. We must recognize that this is not merely literary ambiguity. It is conceptual sabotage hidden in the guise of narrative omission. The choice of the word yellow is not arbitrary, nor merely atmospheric. Within 19th century cultural codes, yellow was the color of sickness, decadence, and forbidden knowledge. The infamous Yellow Book, 1894, associated with aesthetic scandal and Oscar Wilde's downfall, had already charged the color with notions of intellectual and moral contagion. In earlier traditions, yellow signified betrayal, as with Judas's cloak in medieval art, madness, as in yellow bile and melancholic imbalance, and disease, jaundice, fever. Chambers inherits all of these connotations, but he also overlays them with something new: semantic entropy. Yellow, in his lexicon, is not a stable descriptor. It is the color of meaning itself in the eye's act of decay. Just as a yellowing page signals the slow disintegration of a text, so too does the yellow sign mark the point where interpretation ceases to be safe. It is not the color of gold or sunlight. It is the color of dying language. The term sign is equally calculated in its vagueness. It implies both symbol and symptom, a hybrid of communication and contagion. A sign can be a meaningful marker, as in religious iconography, but it can also be a warning, a mark of illness, or a diagnostic signal. Chambers exploits this semantic ambiguity to maximum effect. The yellow sign is never said to do anything in the narrative. Rather, it is seen, remembered, and subsequently re-experienced as a kind of recursive trauma. Consider this carefully. The sign's power lies not in action, but in recognition. Once it is recognized, it cannot be unknown. Its meaning does not unfold, it implodes. It is not a passage to understanding. It is the short-circuiting of understanding itself. In this, the yellow sign mirrors the logic of mimetic viruses, or what modern theorists call info-hazards. Ideas that are harmful not because of what they cause, but because of what they are. We must pause here and examine the deliberate indeterminacy of the sign's visual form. Chambers never tells us what it looks like. He allows his characters to describe its effects, but not its shape. And yet, illustrators, readers, and occultists have for over a century attempted to draw it. This compulsive desire to see what cannot be shown reveals something profound about the sign's function. It provokes the very interpretive behavior it exists to punish. By withholding visual specificity, Chambers creates a blank space that the reader must fill. In doing so, the sign becomes a mirror, not of the world, but of the reader's own need to complete the symbol. This symbolic anxiety is echoed in religious traditions that treat divine names or sacred glyphs as too holy or too dangerous to reproduce. But Chambers' sign is neither holy nor blasphemous. It is empty, and in that emptiness, it becomes insatiable. This is why every attempt to represent the sign feels like an intrusion. Various iterations, from Ambrose Bierce's cross-like design to modern Triskelion spirals, Ouroboros loops, or chaotic glyphs, fail not because they are inaccurate, but because they pretend to resolve what is meant to remain unstable. The act of representation becomes a transgression. Here, we must draw a parallel to Lovecraft's later device of the elder sign, which likewise appears in contradictory forms depending on the narrator or context. But where Lovecraft's sigils function as wards, protective runes that guard against cosmic forces, Chambers' sign offers no defense. It is not protective. It is not magical. It is ontological rot, a glyph that marks the boundary between symbolic coherence and its collapse. To see it is to pass through the membrane that separates the known from the unknowable. Moreover, the yellow sign's linguistic residue persists even when it is not present. Its name, repeated across stories, becomes a performative utterance. What speech act theorists would call a phrase that does not describe reality, but creates it. To say the yellow sign is to open a narrative wound, to conjure a rupture in the reader's epistemic defenses. This is why, despite never seeing it, the reader feels as though they have. The sign is not transmitted through imagery, but through syntax. It is not a symbol within language. It is a symbol against language, one that breaks the circuit between reader and reality by occupying the space where meaning should reside. In this way, the yellow sign is not just a fictional invention. It is a literary mechanism designed to simulate the experience of semantic collapse. It does not say, "You are doomed." It makes you feel the impossibility of interpreting what you've seen. The yellow sign would have remained a curious image, a passing symbol in a minor literary collection, were it not for the remarkable technique Chambers employed to embed it within a broader mythic structure. His innovation lies in how he frames the symbol within layers of narrative suggestion, metafictional distortion, and atmospheric realism. Unlike mythologies rooted in centuries of cultural accumulation, The King in Yellow generates the illusion of an ancient, forbidden tradition in fewer than 10 stories. Consider this carefully. Chambers did not build a mythos by volume or lore. He built it by absence, by withholding answers, cross-referencing fictional documents, and scattering narrative fragments like clues in a half-deciphered prophecy. What results is not a mythology that explains, but one that infects. The mechanism at the heart of this myth-building is the fictional play, also titled The King in Yellow. Across Chambers' stories, characters encounter this script, which is never quoted in full, and suffer psychological breakdown or ontological disintegration shortly after reading it. The play is never fully described, and yet it becomes the narrative axis around which all events spiral. This recursive device, fiction within fiction, madness within art, creates a powerful illusion, the sense that something exists just beyond the reader's reach, something too dangerous to be seen. The yellow sign is thus not only a symbol in the story, it is a symbol of the story's internal logic. Its presence in the text mirrors its effect within the text. Readers who trace its appearances find themselves replicating the fate of Chambers' doomed protagonists. This reveals something profound. The mythos is not consumed passively. It is reenacted through reading. Chambers intensifies this structure by employing a variety of realistic devices to ground his otherwise fantastical tales. He references real-world locations, New York, Paris, and Brittany, alongside invented ones such as Carcosa, Haley, and Hastur. This mingling of actual and imagined geography gives the stories a tone of plausibility that renders the intrusions of the yellow sign more uncanny. His narrators are not hysterics or mystics. They are professionals, artists, scientists, rational minds confronting irrational symbols. This dissonance heightens the horror. It is not the presence of the fantastic that disturbs. It is the suggestion that the fantastic has always been lurking beneath the rational. Chambers' realism, paradoxically, serves to deepen the unreality. He does not paint a world where magic overtakes science, but one where science slowly reveals magic to have been embedded all along. This narrative authenticity extends into structural choices that defy linear storytelling. Many of the tales in The King in Yellow exist in an uncertain temporality, blurring the line between memory and dream, reality and performance. In The Repairer of Reputations, we read the diary of a man whose perception of New York diverges radically from historical fact. The story is set in 1920, years beyond the book's publication, but describes a dystopian monarchy in America that never occurred. The narrator insists it is real. The reader cannot be sure. This is not simply unreliable narration. It is deliberate ontological sabotage. The world itself seems to warp around the presence of the yellow sign, as though history too has been rewritten. We must recognize that Chambers is not merely toying with perception. He is using narrative form to model the very disintegration the sign represents. A central feature of the sign's mythic longevity is its capacity to function as an open symbol, one that invites reinterpretation, expansion, and mimicry. Later writers such as H.P. Lovecraft, August Derleth, and Joseph Pulver would incorporate the yellow sign into their own mythologies, expanding its meanings while preserving its essential ambiguity. Lovecraft notably rarely referenced it directly, but adopted its method, suggestive horror, indirect madness, and unreliable texts. In doing so, he perpetuated the sign's logic rather than its lore. This is key. The yellow sign is not a mythic object in the traditional sense. It is a narrative technique. Each story that invokes it is not merely about the sign. It becomes the sign. It replicates its structure, the withholding of meaning, the illusion of ancient knowledge, the trauma of comprehension. We must also consider the impact of metafictional layering. Chambers writes as though the play, The King in Yellow, predates the book that contains it. He references fictional authors, apocryphal documents, and half-remembered citations. This gives the text the patina of archival recovery, as though the author is merely reporting what has been found. Borges, decades later, would use similar strategies to suggest the existence of impossible books. In this sense, Chambers was a proto-metafictionist, embedding within his horror the appearance of a deeper, ancient narrative. The yellow sign does not gain power from exposition. It gains power from absence, from the reader's attempt to reconstruct the missing play, to see the unseen sign, to know what cannot be known. The symbol is not shown because its function depends on not being shown. The yellow sign is more than an ominous symbol or cursed object. It is a philosophical device that dramatizes the breakdown of all stabilizing narratives. Through it, Chambers constructs a universe not governed by linear causality or rational perception, but one suspended in entropy, dream logic, and existential uncertainty. Where traditional horror terrifies by threatening the body or moral order, the yellow sign annihilates meaning itself. Its effects are not merely psychological, they are metaphysical. The moment of recognition, when a character glimpses the sign, reads the play, or perceives the truth of Carcosa, is always accompanied by a profound loss of ontological security. This is the heart of its horror, not that the world is monstrous, but that the mind was never designed to comprehend what the world actually is. We must recognize that Chambers' fiction articulates an early form of what would later be termed cosmic horror, though with a different vector of force. While Lovecraft's terrors emerge from vast, indifferent universes filled with ancient entities, Chambers' cosmos is terrifying because it is overwritten by something intelligible, something beautiful, elegant, and absolutely wrong. His protagonists do not recoil from the grotesque, but are seduced by it. In stories like The Repairer of Reputations and The Yellow Sign, the initial encounter with the forbidden object or knowledge does not inspire revulsion. It inspires obsession. The yellow sign functions as an aesthetic rupture. It invites the viewer into a higher, seemingly more ordered reality, only to reveal that this new reality consumes the old one. It is not a confrontation with chaos. It is a confrontation with an order beyond comprehension. The philosophical principle at work here is insignificance, not in the nihilistic sense of meaninglessness, but in the sense of being incompatible with what is truly real. Characters who witness the yellow sign are not told they are meaningless. They are shown that their assumptions about reality were never relevant. The universe continues, but without them in it as coherent observers. This is closely aligned with the concept of epistemic alienation, in which one discovers that the frameworks used to interpret the world, reason, morality, language, are artifacts of human limitation, not descriptions of cosmic truth. The horror of the yellow sign lies in its ability to reveal this gap. It is not a portal to another world. It is a rupture in this one, through which the true structure of things briefly becomes visible. And it is that glimpse, not the world itself, that drives its victims to disintegration. Chambers' integration of entropy, both thermodynamic and symbolic, is central to the sign's function. In physics, entropy describes the gradual loss of energy into disorder, the irreversible movement toward equilibrium. In semiotics, we might understand entropy as the degradation of language's ability to signify. The yellow sign represents both. It is a symbol whose very presence accelerates the dissolution of interpretive order. Once introduced into a narrative, it disrupts causality, linearity, and identity. In The Yellow Sign, the painter dreams of a rotting figure long before he encounters it, suggesting that time itself has unraveled. This collapse is not random. It is guided by a logic the human mind can perceive just enough to realize its own failure. The sign does not cause chaos. It enacts perfect order that simply excludes the observer. The horror is not that the world falls apart. It's that it was never built for us in the first place. We must pause here to examine the concept of dream reality, which surfaces repeatedly in Chambers' stories and later in Lovecraft's dream cycle. Carcosa, the city associated with the sign, obeys dream logic. It is simultaneously ancient and futuristic, real and imagined, known and unknowable. In the play within the story, characters often awaken to find they were never awake. This recursive structure, dreams within dreams, plays within plays, creates a destabilizing effect in which no narrative anchor can be trusted. Readers begin to suspect that even the framing story may be part of the infection. Philosophically, this echoes the radical doubt of Descartes' evil demon, who deceives perception itself, and anticipates Baudrillard's notion of hyperreality, a condition in which simulation becomes more real than the real. The yellow sign embodies this shift. It does not represent illusion. It reveals that what we took to be real was already performance. A rhetorical question arises here, and we should not shy away from it. If the sign merely shows us what was always true, why is that knowledge so destructive? The answer lies in the boundary between cognition and identity. Human beings do not perceive the world neutrally. We interpret it through narrative, causality, and selfhood. The yellow sign severs those interpretive tools. It reveals a universe not of randomness, but of absolute order, devoid of meaning. That revelation is not frightening because it threatens death. It is frightening because it threatens coherence. To see the yellow sign is to see the mask of the world drop, not to reveal a monster, but to reveal the absence of anything familiar beneath. To discuss the yellow sign without invoking its associated pantheon is to misunderstand its function. The sign is not a standalone symbol. It is the trace of a larger presence, the residue of a cosmology that bleeds into the margins of reality. Behind it stands the king in yellow, and behind the king is something older still, Carcosa, Halley, the twin suns, and perhaps even Hastur, whose name lingers like a half-erased inscription in the margins of forbidden books. But these are not gods in any conventional sense. They are not subjects of worship or beings with personalities. They are conceptual entities, metaphysical phenomena cloaked in symbolic dress. To speak of the king in yellow is not to describe a figure, but to describe a disturbance in the structure of narrative itself. He is less character than algorithm, less monarch than mask. The king in yellow first appears as a character within the titular play mentioned throughout the king in yellow stories. He is described only obliquely, his face hidden behind a mask, his presence a harbinger of collapse. In The Repairer of Reputations, the king is referenced as a figure whose arrival signifies madness, while, in The Yellow Sign, he is not mentioned directly, but his influence is felt in the slow unraveling of time, sanity, and identity. It is not what the king does that defines him, it is what follows wherever he is named. His presence is an event horizon. Those who encounter him are changed, not through dialogue or contact, but through ontological reconfiguration. The king in yellow is the moment a story ceases to obey its own rules. He is not malevolent, he is structural. We must pause here and consider the fictional city of Carcosa, which functions less as a location and more as a gravitational field of unreality. Originally coined by Ambrose Bierce in the short story An Inhabitant of Carcosa, 1886, the name was appropriated and expanded by Chambers. In his stories, Carcosa is described in surreal, dreamlike terms. Black stars, dim suns, ruins whose geometry resists memory. Carcosa is not a place one visits. It is a place one remembers having visited, even if one has never left. This temporal distortion, a memory of a future dream, serves as an extension of the sign's epistemic damage. Carcosa exists in the subjunctive mood of narrative. It is not where the characters are. It is where the story thinks it might be going. In this way, Carcosa operates like a virus in narrative form, infecting space and time with recursive disorientation. One of the more opaque figures in this cosmology is Hastur, a name that originally appeared in Bierce's fiction as a benign location, later transformed by August Derleth into a cosmic deity in his attempt to systematize the mythos. Lovecraft himself mentioned Hastur rarely and ambiguously, never clearly defining it as a being or force. In Chambers' work, Hastur is more often a syllabic echo, part of a triadic litany. Hastur, Carcosa, Haley. Its repetition suggests incantation, not explanation. What matters is not what Hastur is, but what its name does. Disrupt narrative, create anxiety, suggest scale. Consider carefully. These names function not as lore, but as lexical thresholds. To speak them aloud in the fiction is to signal the point beyond which characters begin to dissolve. The yellow sign itself, then, is the emissary of this entire symbolic system. It is not merely linked to the king, it is the king, abstracted. Some readers interpret it as his seal, others as his eye, others as a mask within the mask. But all interpretations agree on its function. Once seen, it cannot be unseen, and its presence marks the viewer as already altered. In The Yellow Sign, the painter dreams of death before he meets it. The sign does not warn, it retroactively explains. This suggests a cosmology in which cause and effect are non-linear, in which fate is not foretold, but pre-experienced. The sign, in this sense, may not signal danger. It may signal the collapse of time itself. The viewer is no longer in a story with a beginning, middle, and end. They are inside a loop whose logic is foreign to human understanding. We must recognize that these entities, if they can be called such, serve not as gods but as narrative pressures. They do not act, they distort. In this, they resemble the dreamlands beings of Lovecraft, who inhabit liminal realms governed by alien laws of perception and consciousness. But whereas Lovecraft's gods are distant, unknowable, and often dormant, Chambers' king walks in beauty. He is always near, always smiling, always behind the mask. His horror is intimate. This intimacy is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Yellow Sign mythos. The idea that the forces undoing your reality are not far away but embedded within it, folded into its sentences, watching from behind its punctuation. To observe a cursed symbol is one thing. To internalize it is another. The yellow sign does not simply trigger madness in the psychological sense. It reorients the human subject around an entirely different set of ontological principles. Those who encounter it do not scream, flee, or burn with religious insight. They disintegrate slowly from the inside out. Madness in Chambers. The King in Yellow stories is not abrupt. It is cumulative, corrosive, intimate. It unfolds not as spectacle but as subtle epistemic erosion, where the mind does not break violently but recedes into a logic it was never meant to understand. This is not madness in the Gothic or Romantic tradition. It is not the price of forbidden lust or ancestral sin. It is the inevitable byproduct of contact with a different kind of reality. Consider the unnamed artist in The Yellow Sign. He dreams persistently of a corpse-like man, dreams so vivid that they begin to affect his waking life. The horror intensifies not when the dream intrudes, but when he begins to accept it as normal. The threshold into madness is crossed not through fear, but through familiarity. The stranger he fears becomes a companion. His nightmares become oracles. And when he finds the yellow sign in a book gifted by his model, there is no scream, only a dawning recognition. The horror here is quiet, procedural. Madness emerges not as delusion, but as recognition, the gradual realization that the world was never what it seemed. This reveals something profound. The madness induced by the yellow sign is not the failure of the mind, but its success in perceiving too clearly. We must recognize that Chambers' vision of madness is diagnostic, not punitive. His characters are often artists, scholars, aesthetes, individuals whose sensitivity to beauty makes them vulnerable to its weaponized form. Their minds are not weak, they are too finely tuned, too eager to decode symbols that were never meant to be read. In The Repairer of Reputations, the narrator imagines himself at the center of a vast royalist conspiracy following his encounter with the play. His delusion is not random, it is structured. It has history, hierarchy, and ritual. It mimics coherence. And yet, to every other character in the story, he is deeply insane. The brilliance of Chambers' approach lies in his refusal to arbitrate. We, the readers, cannot be certain whether the narrator is delusional or prophetic. The narrative itself is infected, and in reading it, so are we. This type of madness aligns with what modern scholars of horror and speculative fiction call ontological horror. The terror, not that the world is unknowable, but that it is knowable in a way that renders us obsolete. Unlike psychological horror, which locates fear within the individual, ontological horror externalizes it. It stems from the realization that the rules governing identity, causality, and perception are not stable. The yellow sign does not change people. It reveals that they were always changing, always adrift in a reality that merely pretended to be fixed. It is not madness that descends, it is certainty that evaporates. And in the absence of certainty, the self cannot hold. Here, we must pause and ask a question both rhetorical and diagnostic. What happens when a symbol is not understood, but inhabits? The yellow sign does not require belief to function. Its effects are not mediated by faith or ritual. They are automatic, like a virus attaching itself to the nervous system. Those who see it are changed, not because they believe in it, but because they have come into contact with its logic. The sign carries no message. It is not a warning. It is an operating system, an alien grammar into which the human mind is forcibly retranslated. This is why the madness it causes is not consistent. Some become paranoid kings, others lose all affect. Some dream of distant cities they have never visited. The symptoms vary, but the diagnosis is the same. The world no longer fits. There are comparisons to be made here with Lovecraft's later models of madness, in which forbidden knowledge unmoors the psyche from its terrestrial anchors. In The Call of Cthulhu, the mere idea that humanity is insignificant drives men to madness and suicide. But in Chambers, the madness is closer. It is not the vastness of the cosmos that drives the self into collapse, but the proximity of something eerily familiar. The King in Yellow is not a tentacled horror, but a noble figure, a masked monarch. His court is not monstrous, it is regal. The stories do not depict descent into chaos, but into another order, one more elegant and more terrifying, precisely because it makes sense, just not human sense. The human mind does not go mad from disorder, but from recognizing a pattern it cannot survive. The yellow sign is not dangerous because it contains knowledge. It is dangerous because it is knowledge, and, more precisely, a kind of forbidden knowledge that annihilates the structures needed to understand it. The term forbidden in this context does not imply restriction by external authorities, as in religious or political censorship. Rather, it indicates that the content itself is fundamentally incompatible with human cognition. Chambers does not describe knowledge as a gradual ascent toward understanding, but as a precipice. Once crossed, the subject is no longer situated within reality as they knew it. They have not simply acquired new information, they have changed ontological categories. In this sense, the yellow sign represents not hidden truth, but a truth that hides the possibility of meaning itself. In Chambers' stories, those who encounter the sign or read The King in Yellow play are not enlightened, they are destabilized. The knowledge they gain is not additive, but subtractive. It removes their ability to distinguish reality from delusion, identity from narrative, or self from symbol. Consider the narrator in The Repairer of Reputations, whose entire sense of self as a royal figure may be a delusion, or may not. What matters is not which is true, but that the knowledge he has absorbed makes such distinctions irrelevant. This mirrors the modern philosophical concept of epistemic rupture, the idea that certain revelations do not expand one's worldview, but destroy the possibility of having one. The yellow sign does not impart a message. It dissolves the boundary between the messenger and the recipient, until interpretation itself is no longer possible. We must recognize that Chambers' vision of forbidden knowledge anticipates, not by coincidence, but by intellectual inheritance, the later cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft's protagonists routinely suffer madness upon discovering truths about the universe's indifference to humanity. But Chambers' horror is subtler and more linguistically attuned. The forbidden knowledge here is not about extraterrestrial beings or vast temporal scales. It is about the fragility of symbol systems, the realization that reality might be nothing more than a fragile narrative, one that the yellow sign can unwrite. The play. The King in Yellow, referenced but never revealed in full, behaves like an infectious text, a self-replicating structure that alters perception just by being encountered. The reader becomes participant, the participant becomes character, and the character becomes lost in a story they cannot escape. This mechanism aligns disturbingly well with contemporary notions of info hazards, concepts, facts, or images that are harmful by virtue of their content alone. Philosopher Nick Bostrom describes these as information that causes harm or risk merely by being learned or communicated. The yellow sign is perhaps literature's earliest dramatization of this idea. It is not cursed because of some magical property, nor does it contain a spell. It is a cognitohazard, dangerous precisely because it bypasses emotional and ethical defenses and acts directly upon epistemological structure. In a world governed by linguistic and symbolic interpretation, to alter those systems is to alter the mind itself. The sign does not kill. It removes the architecture that makes living comprehensible. Importantly, the reader of Chambers' work is not immune. The stories are designed to implicate the audience in the very collapse they depict. This is why the yellow sign is never described directly, because to describe it would be to reduce its danger. Instead, it is named, hinted at, referenced obliquely, allowing it to function as a negative symbol, a placeholder for what cannot be thought without consequence. Readers, by filling in the blank with their own interpretive anxiety, participate in its power. This reflexive structure makes the text itself into a vehicle for epistemic disruption. It is not a matter of belief or disbelief. Exposure is sufficient. To know of the yellow sign is to begin suspecting that the real world may not be secure, that symbols may not be passive, and that thought itself can contain pathogens. A final question remains, and we must not ignore it. If knowledge is fatal, is ignorance a form of safety, or simply a delay? Chambers offers no answer, but his story suggests that avoidance is futile. His characters are not evil. They are curious, intelligent, aesthetically inclined. And it is precisely those qualities, their yearning to know, that leads them to ruin. The forbidden knowledge they encounter does not punish sin. It reveals the contingency of sanity itself. In a universe that operates on alien narrative principles, the human mind is not an asset. It is a liability. The characters fall not because they are wrong, but because they are no longer relevant. The knowledge they uncover does not reshape the world. It simply shows that their place in it was never secure. The first appearance of the yellow sign, and its surrounding mythology, occurs not in isolation, but within a complex web of intertextual suggestions that Robert W. Chambers weaves throughout his 1895 collection, The King in Yellow. It is essential to understand that these stories do not build a cohesive mythos in the traditional sense. Rather, they hint, echo, and allude. The sign is referenced only a handful of times across the 10 stories, yet its absence becomes presence, its indirectness a deliberate invitation to projection. Chambers does not offer an origin story, a theology, or a cosmology. Instead, he offers something more potent, a suggestion that something unspeakable exists just beneath the surface of what appears to be realistic fiction. It is through this technique that the yellow sign enters literary history, not as a symbol, but as a fracture in narrative stability itself. The yellow sign first appears by name in the story titled The Yellow Sign, and its mention is spare, brief, and strategically vague. The narrator, an artist living in New York, receives a small, mysterious book from his model, an object inscribed with the sign. Shortly thereafter, his dreams begin to decay. He sees a pallid man watching him from a churchyard. He begins to suspect that time and fate have lost their sequence. Most crucially, he cannot remember when he started to unravel. The sign itself is never described visually. Its power lies not in what it looks like, but in what it does. It acts as a silent operator, triggering a dislocation in the narrator's perception of causality, identity, and mortality. This reveals something crucial. The yellow sign does not operate as a mere plot device. It reorders narrative logic itself. We must recognize that the power of Chambers' early stories comes not from world building in the traditional sense, but from his ability to simulate mythic density through elliptical reference. In The Repairer of Reputations, arguably the most ambitious and disturbing tale in the collection, we encounter a protagonist living in a distorted vision of the future, New York City in 1920, ruled by an American monarchy. The entire story is framed as a diary, with the narrator believing himself to be the heir to a royal conspiracy centered around the return of the king in yellow. His belief stems, as in other stories, from reading the play. What makes this tale so disorienting is not its events, but its tone of certainty. The narrator is utterly convinced that reality has changed, but the world around him offers no confirmation. Readers are thus placed in the same position as the characters, uncertain, suspended, epistemologically unmoored. The intertextual depth of the mythos is amplified by Chambers' incorporation of names and locations that he did not originate. The name Carcosa, for instance, first appeared in Ambrose Bierce's 1886 story, An Inhabitant of Carcosa, where it denoted a mysterious, forgotten city, glimpsed only in a moment of spiritual detachment. Bierce's original tale already contained elements of temporal confusion, death awareness, and dreamlike space. Chambers borrowed the name Wholesale, along with Holly and Hastur, and reframed them within a theatrical cosmology, suggesting not simply a location, but a whole structure of reality governed by these shadowy entities. We must pause here. Chambers was not plagiarizing. He was reinvoking. This act of reuse mimics the oral traditions of myth, in which names and symbols travel across centuries, accruing new associations while never stabilizing into definitive meaning. The concept of the play within a story is also central to the intertextual framework of The King in Yellow. Chambers references the play in several stories, often in fragments. He quotes haunting lines, "Strange is the night where black stars rise," and refers to its second act as the catalyst for madness. But the play is never shown in full. This strategy of omission allows the reader's imagination to become a collaborator in the myth-making process. The reader, like the character, sees only glimpses, fragments, hints, and in that absence, myth flourishes. As scholars have noted, this device functions similarly to Lovecraft's later treatment of the Necronomicon, which is never fully quoted but exerts its gravity through its unreadability. Chambers set the precedent that a fictional artifact could become more powerful by being only partially visible. One must also consider the poetic epigraphs that frame several stories. These seemingly disconnected quotes from the fictional play, The King in Yellow, act like dark koans, embedding the narrative with an aura of preordained doom. For instance, the off-cited line, "Have you found the yellow sign?" opens the yellow sign like a dare, transforming a question into an accusation. These textual fragments act as keys without locks, signposts that do not point anywhere. They give the impression of a larger, interconnected mythology while denying access to it. This technique of symbolic scattering invites pattern recognition while withholding resolution, a literary sleight of hand that would later be perfected by Borges, Ligotti, and Mark Z. Danielewski in House of Leaves. Chambers remarkably anticipated them all. Among the 10 stories in The King in Yellow, none encapsulates the corrosive, symbolic power of the yellow sign quite so precisely as the eponymous tale, The Yellow Sign. First published in 1895, this short story serves as the thematic and metaphysical core of the entire collection. It does not explain the sign, it enacts its logic. This is a critical distinction. The story functions less as a narrative and more as a case study in epistemic contagion, an intimate chronicle of what happens to a human consciousness once infected by the mere presence of the sign. We must recognize that The Yellow Sign is not about horror as spectacle. It is about the slow, sickening recognition that one's mind is already complicit in its own undoing. The plot is deceptively mundane at first. An artist, unnamed, is working on religious paintings in his New York studio. His model, Tessie, becomes both muse and companion. Their relationship is delicate, even endearing. But something is wrong. The artist has been dreaming of a repulsive figure, a bloated, decaying man who loiters. Outside the Trinity churchyard, Tessie, too, begins to see this figure, though neither can explain who or what he is. As the dreams intensify, Tessie gives the narrator a small book she found in his library, a copy of The King in Yellow. Inside is the yellow sign. From this moment on, the tone shifts. The story becomes less about what is seen and more about what is already known but cannot yet be accepted. The horror, like the corpse at the door, was always there. It was simply waiting to be recognized. Chambers never describes the yellow sign itself. Its effects, however, are immediate and irreversible. Upon seeing it, the narrator grows ill, weak, disoriented. He suffers from dreams that bleed into waking life. The rooms seem to fill with the odor of decay, he says, a symbolic merging of perception and decomposition. But the sign does not just affect the narrator's body, it unravels the coherence of his perception. When the churchyard watchman, the figure from his dreams, enters the apartment to kill Tessie, the narrator cannot distinguish between reality and vision. He recognizes the watchman not as a stranger, but as something long known. This is a narrative clue. The sign does not bring madness through violence. It induces a fatal clarity, a sudden reorganization of memory, dream, and symbol into a pattern that can no longer be resisted. It is essential to note how Chambers uses subtle disruptions of time to signal the sign's metaphysical intrusion. In the beginning, the narrator speaks confidently, logically, but as the story progresses, time becomes warped. He mentions things before they happen. Tessie senses doom before the cause is revealed. The line between dream and waking life begins to blur. This is not merely stylistic. It mirrors the structure of the play within the story. The King in Yellow, whose second act, we are told in other stories, causes readers to lose their minds. The play is never quoted in full, but its structure, a shift from theatrical fiction to inescapable truth, is mirrored in the story's own breakdown. The yellow sign becomes a metaplay, and we, the readers, become participants in its unfolding. Scholars have often observed that the horror in The Yellow Sign is not rooted in confrontation with evil, but in coexistence with the unknowable. The Watchman is not a demon or a killer in the conventional sense. He is more like a spiritual courier, an agent of transition. His presence confirms what the sign has already begun, a shift from the world of surfaces to the world of structures. When Tessie dies, the narrator does not scream or rage. He accepts it with a numbed inevitability, suggesting that the sign's greatest power lies not in violence, but in the surrender of will. The characters do not resist because resistance is no longer structurally available to them. The sign has rewritten the laws of choice. One must also consider the symbolist and decadent underpinnings of a narrative. Chambers was influenced by fin de siècle Parisian literature, and this influence is palpable in his portrayal of the artist, whose attraction to the mysterious and the aesthetic primes him for ruin. The yellow sign, in this context, is the ultimate decadent symbol, beautiful, fatal, and aesthetically inexhaustible. Like Wilde's green carnation or Huysman's jeweled tortoise, the sign is not explained, it is admired, feared, and eventually consumed. The artist's doom is not his fault. It is the inevitable end of a trajectory that begins with the pursuit of beauty at any cost. He does not fall because he is weak. He falls because he sees too clearly. This reveals something crucial. The sign is not punishment. It is insight. Insight that the mind cannot survive. If the yellow sign serves as a study in intimate epistemic collapse, then The Repairer of Reputations, 1895, functions as its grander, more disorienting sibling, a story in which the entire structure of reality, history, and national identity is cast into doubt. It is not merely a tale of madness, it is a tale that madness writes. Chambers here creates not just an unreliable narrator, but a world infected by the same narrative logic as the yellow sign itself, a reality that bends, flexes, and ultimately dissolves under the weight of a symbol that cannot be seen but is always felt. We must recognize that this story is not simply eccentric. It is architecturally broken on purpose, and in that fracture, the sign pulses silently. Set in a surreal alternate 1920s New York, a date that was still 25 years in the future at the time of publication, The Repairer of Reputations opens with a seemingly objective account of political events. The United States has become an aristocratic state. Suicide booths are legal. Anti-Semitic laws have been codified. The narrator, Hildred Castaigne, insists that he is heir to the imperial dynasty of America. His belief is supported by a character named Mr. Wilde, a deformed man who runs a shadowy operation from his apartment. But as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that Hildred is either a paranoid lunatic or a victim of a deeper cosmological contamination. The reader is caught between two possibilities. Either the world is insane, or Hildred is. Crucially, Chambers refuses to decide. The effect is perfect uncertainty. What makes this story an effective vector for the yellow sign's logic is its lack of center. Everything about The Repairer of Reputations undermines traditional narrative cohesion. The setting is both familiar and unrecognizable. The political structure is plausible yet preposterous. The protagonist is confident, articulate, and utterly detached from consensus reality. He speaks of a book, The Imperial Dynasty of America, and a play, The King in Yellow, that have shaped his worldview. But the content of these texts is never fully revealed. Instead, the story's structure mimics the second act of the fictional play itself, the very part that is said to drive readers mad. It begins in clarity and ends in recursive madness. The reader becomes, like Hildred, caught in a reality that only resembles the one they thought they understood. There are moments in the text when the yellow sign's presence is not mentioned outright, yet its signature logic is unmistakable. Time warps subtly. Events are narrated out of sequence. Objects appear and disappear. People behave as though under a spell, agreeing with Hildred in some scenes, then contradicting him in others. When Hildred claims his cousin Louis is attempting to steal the throne, he assembles a conspiracy, drawing lines between minor figures and world-shaping events. But we begin to suspect that Mr. Wilde, the titular repairer, is not aiding him, but manipulating him. Wilde, whose name invokes the decadent and symbolist traditions, may be a person, a hallucination, or an aspect of Hildred's own splintering psyche. He is always scribbling in secret. He is always watching. He knows things. But what kind of knowing does the yellow sign make possible? We must pause here and consider that the repairer of reputations is not a political allegory or dystopian satire in any modern sense. It is not Orwellian. It is not Kafkaesque. It is Chambersian, a term we might now use to describe narratives where reality is overwritten, not by ideology, but by infection. The yellow sign is never shown in this story, yet it is the hidden operator behind every distortion. It acts not as a symbol within the plot, but as the software running beneath it. The world has already been rewritten, and Hildred's madness is merely the point at which perception aligns with that hidden reality. This creates a terrifying implication. Hildred may not be deluded at all. He may simply be the first person to read the world correctly. The price for such clarity, however, is everything. Chambers' narrative strategy in this story reflects what modern theorists call diegetic contamination, when the rules of the fictional world are themselves infected by the themes of the story. The unreliable narrator does not tell a coherent lie. He tells a fragmented truth, filtered through a lens that has already been compromised. Just as the King in Yellow play drives its readers mad by presenting a truth that the mind cannot accept, so does this story present a world that makes perfect sense only if the yellow sign has already rewritten the logic of the real. The horror here is systemic, not situational. It is not that something terrible is about to happen. It is that it already has, and our inability to remember or comprehend it is part of the effect. The afterlife of the king in yellow mythology is not the story of a fixed canon being passed down intact. It is the story of echoes, distortions, and elaborations. A mythos not preserved, but reinfected by each new contributor. Robert W. Chambers provided only fragments, a few names, a cursed play, a symbol never clearly described. And yet, from these fragments, later authors have conjured entire worlds. Writers like H.P. Lovecraft, August Derleth, Carl Edward Wagner, and contemporary figures such as Joseph Pulver and Caitlin R. Kiernan have all extended the yellow sign's reach, not by clarifying it, but by amplifying its ambiguity. What results is not a single mythos, but a family of overlapping realities, each orbiting the same black sun of meaninglessness. It is widely acknowledged that H.P. Lovecraft's engagement with the yellow sign and its related concepts was limited but deliberate. In a 1931 letter to Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft writes that Chambers' early work contains rare touches of cosmic horror, though he found the stories uneven. Nevertheless, Lovecraft absorbed Chambers' terminology, Carcosa, Hastur, Lake Halley, and inserted them, often cryptically, into his own stories. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, Hastur is mentioned among a litany of alien gods: Yog Sothoth, Shub Niggurath, Hastur, the yellow sign. But here, the sign is not explained, it is invoked. Lovecraft understood that the power of such symbols lies not in their definition, but in their ability to destabilize the surrounding text. His use of Chambers is less homage than integration, folding one epistemic virus into another. August Derleth, Lovecraft's posthumous editor and mythmaker, took a different approach. Seeking to systematize the chaos of Lovecraft's universe, Derleth placed Hastur within a mythological taxonomy, assigning it to the elemental air and casting it as an enemy of Cthulhu. He named the King in Yellow as an avatar of Hastur, and the yellow sign became a formal emblem of allegiance. But in doing so, Derleth arguably domesticated what had been inherently elusive. He turned ambiguity into allegory, unknowable horror into cosmic theology. Scholars remain divided on this legacy. Some credit Derleth with preserving and popularizing the mythos. Others suggest he betrayed its core by converting anti-structure into structure. We must recognize that Derleth's vision of the yellow sign is not wrong. It is simply a different narrative organism, one that evolves through simplification. Later, writers attempted to reclaim the mystery. Carl Edward Wagner's short story, The River of Night's Dreaming, 1981, returns the yellow sign to its decadent, dreamlike origins. Set in a surreal asylum run by women in masks, the story features hallucinations, spectral presences, and invocations of the King in Yellow that feel more like dream logic than plot development. Wagner does not explain the sign. He lets it haunt the architecture. Similarly, Joseph S. Pulver Sr., in collections like Blood Will Have Its Season and A Season in Carcosa, channels Chambers' symbolist aesthetics, often using experimental prose and fragmented structure to mirror the sign's effects. His work suggests that to write about the yellow sign is to surrender to it, to write as if already infected. Caitlin R. Kiernan, in stories like Andromeda Among the Stones and Houses Under the Sea, has developed what might be called a psychic archaeology of the sign. Rather than depict it directly, she buries it in personal trauma, half-seen rituals, and blurred boundaries between memory and hallucination. Kiernan's characters are often scholars or artists, echoing Chambers' archetypes, but their descent is slower, subtler, and steeped in loss. The yellow sign in her work is not only a glyph or mark, it is an absence shaped like knowledge, something her characters feel more than find. In this, Kiernan reestablishes a principle that has persisted across all adaptations. The sign is not content. It is contact, a moment of cognitive dissonance that cannot be resolved. We must pause to consider the narrative logic of contamination that governs the yellow sign across these later iterations. It spreads not by being explained, but by being repeated. Its shape is unknown, yet it appears in anthologies, games, films, and music. Its meaning is contradictory, yet consistent. Wherever it surfaces, reality frays. This is its true evolution, not a refinement, but a widening of the narrative aperture. The sign becomes less a symbol and more a mode of storytelling, recursive, unstable, subjective. Each author who engages it does not clarify its meaning. They expand the perimeter of its infection. The sign does not grow by addition. It grows by accretion of ambiguity. The yellow sign has never been found in the ruins of a temple or carved into the walls of an ancient tomb. It has no archaeological record, no ethnographic trail, no reliable visual consistency across its appearances. And yet, it persists. It is whispered about in online forums, embedded in internet lore, and sometimes even claimed to have been seen by those who were not reading Chambers at all. We must recognize that the yellow sign has entered the realm of urban legend, where fiction ceases to be a category and becomes instead a modality. A way of framing experience rather than explaining it. It survives not through belief, but through pattern recognition, through those uncanny moments when something feels off and demands an explanation beyond the ordinary. Reports of the sign's appearance in non-literary contexts began as early as the 1990s on bulletin boards like Usenet, and later on forums like the SCP Foundation and AR Creepypasta. Users would post images, often sigils of unknown provenance, asking, "Is this the yellow sign?" Some claim to have seen it in graffiti, on bathroom mirrors, in dreams, or scrawled in the margins of discarded library books. Others described a strange synchronicity. After reading about it, they began noticing it everywhere. This mimetic spread mimics the narrative logic of the sign itself. It cannot be clearly, as you see, identified, yet once introduced into consciousness, it seems to recur, like a word you've just learned, suddenly appearing in every conversation. The hoax becomes self-propagating, not through fraud, but through suggestibility. One of the most cited incidents in this vein is the so-called Red Hook Yellow sign, a story that circulated on paranormal message boards in the early 2000s. According to the original poster, a strange symbol resembling an angular eye was spray-painted repeatedly along a 3-block stretch in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Accompanying it were cryptic flyers quoting lines from The King in Yellow, specifically the phrase, "Have you seen the yellow sign?" Photos of the graffiti circulated widely, though skeptics pointed out that the symbol did not match any known iconography from the original text. That, of course, only added to the mystique. It was not about matching Chambers. It was about proving he had predicted something that was still unfolding. Urban legends feed not on accuracy, but on the impossibility of disproof. There is an important psychological function at work here. In a secularized, digitized world, where religious awe has been replaced by algorithmic saturation, the human mind still seeks the numinous, that which resists explanation, yet insists upon meaning. The yellow sign, vague as it is, operates like a secular sacred symbol. It becomes a repository for unease, a way to name that feeling that something has gone wrong with the structure of reality itself. It is not unlike other modern myths, the Slender Man, the back rooms, or the Mandela effect. But while those myths externalize the threat, a creature, a space, a false memory, the yellow sign internalizes it. It is a myth about the contamination of interpretation. The danger is not outside the mind. It is in the act of meaning-making itself. We must pause here to consider a rhetorical question that surfaces again and again in these online testimonies. What if the yellow sign is not fictional, but conceptual? What if it does not exist as a design symbol, but as an emergent structure that recurs whenever narrative cohesion breaks down? This is not unlike Jung's theory of the archetype, a symbol that recurs across cultures not through transmission, but through shared psychological architecture. In this light, the yellow sign becomes a kind of semiotic poltergeist, a ghost in the machine of language itself. It may not be real, but it behaves as if it were, and that behavioral reality has proven sufficient for it to embed itself in subcultural lore. It is not the sign's shape that matters. It is the experience of recognizing something you should not recognize, as though meaning has been smuggled into your consciousness by an unknown author. Interestingly, the yellow sign has also been the subject of intentional hoaxes and artistic experiments, further blurring the line between fiction and folklore. In 2013, a Tumblr user created a series of fabricated journal pages supposedly found in an abandoned psychiatric hospital. The pages were filled with nonsensical diagrams, repetitive script, and a glyph labeled the yellow sign. The project was explicitly fictional, yet commenters reported strange dreams, headaches, and synchronicities after viewing it. Whether these reports were real, performative, or ironic remains unclear. But again, we return to the core function of the myth. Uncertainty is the fuel. A hoax about the yellow sign, once encountered, has the same psychological effect as a true story. The point is not truth, the point is contamination. The yellow sign, as introduced by Chambers, was never intended as a fixed sigil or image. It was a symbolic contagion, more psychological than visual. This ambiguity has made it uniquely suited for transmedia adaptation. In film, games, and music, the sign has not been faithfully replicated so much as reinterpreted, stretched into new forms that preserve its core function: narrative disruption and epistemic collapse. Unlike traditional monsters or clearly defined magic systems, the yellow sign is not a thing to be seen. It is an event, a fracture in meaning, a glyph that infects plot lines. As such, its reappearance across media reflects the continued evolution of horror itself, from monsters of the flesh to monsters of form, language, and consciousness. Perhaps the most visible appearance of the yellow sign in mainstream media comes from HBO's True Detective, Season 1, 2014, which explicitly references the king in yellow and features a spiral-shaped symbol that fans quickly identified as a modern interpretation of the sign. In the show, characters encounter cryptic references to Carcosa, the Yellow King, and cosmic horror motifs deeply indebted to Chambers and Lovecraft alike. The spiral, painted on walls and tattooed on victims, serves as both narrative clue and psychological trap. It does not explain, it implicates. As the detectives spiral deeper into their investigation, their grip on reality loosens, mirroring the experience of Chambers' characters. Crucially, the show never defines the Yellow King. It allows the mythology to remain unresolved, preserving the interpretive disquiet that defines the sign. In the world of tabletop and video games, the yellow sign has found fertile ground. Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game, Chaosium 1981 present, features Hastur and the yellow sign as core elements of its mythos, though the representation has often leaned on August Derleth's later theological interpretations. Here, the sign functions as both a narrative tool and a mechanical one, causing sanity loss, triggering hallucinations, and marking characters for doom. In The Sinking City, Frogware's 2019, a Lovecraftian detective game, players encounter symbols and plot lines referencing the king in yellow. What's telling is how these games use the sign not as a weapon or goal, but as interface, disturbance, blurring UI, altering text, even corrupting save files. The yellow sign becomes not just a plot device, but a metatextual operator, extending its contamination into the player's experience. We must pause here and consider why the yellow sign thrives in interactive media. Games and immersive environments allow for non-linear storytelling, fragmented discovery, and player compulsion, precisely the narrative tools that Chambers employed in literary form. The sign's ambiguity makes it ideal for environmental storytelling, where players uncover pieces of lore without receiving clear resolution. In games like Bloodborne from Software 2015, while not officially tied to Chambers' work, visual motifs, themes of forbidden knowledge, and sigils resembling the sign saturate the world. Madness is not a side effect, but a statistic. Carcosa may not be named, but it is present in spirit. A city half-remembered, glimpsed in dreams, saturated with rot and unknowable gods. The sign is never shown, but its logic is felt, shaping level design, narrative arcs, and even player behavior. In music, the yellow sign has manifested most often within metal, ambient, and experimental genres, particularly those concerned with themes of cosmic nihilism. Bands like The Great Old Ones, Yith, and Carcosa, a Canadian deathcore band, reference Chambers and the sign in their lyrics, album art, and song titles. The musical interpretations often focus not on lore, but on atmosphere, the overwhelming sense of dissolution, the clash between beauty and dread, harmony and dissonance. In some avant-garde noise projects, Yellow Sign has even been used as the title for albums composed to induce discomfort through arrhythmic patterns and subtle feedback loops. These compositions do not tell a story. They simulate the sensation of a mind unraveling, not in terror, but in exposure to a structure it cannot comprehend. Consider carefully. The sign's migration across media does not stabilize its meaning, it fractures it further. Each appearance in games, shows, or music adds not clarity, but volume to the mythos. The yellow sign has become a floating signifier, a cipher through which artists can channel unease, aesthetic decadence, or structural horror. This pattern mirrors what theorist Mark Fisher described as the weird and the eerie, a disruption in the order of things that invites explanation only to deny it. The yellow sign is not a symbol for evil. It is a symbol for unexplained order, for narrative patterns that do not resolve, for a universe in which form has replaced meaning. It fits not because it is coherent, but because it resonates across fragmented domains. The yellow sign's ambiguity is not a defect. It is its function. Precisely because it lacks a canonical image, stable meaning, or clear ontological status, it has become exceptionally adaptable, a symbol ripe for appropriation across subcultures, academic disciplines, and digital communities. We must recognize that what began as a passing invention in a few of Chambers' stories has now become a kind of semiotic rogue agent, infiltrating critical theory, internet subcultures, aesthetic philosophy, and even fringe political and spiritual movements. The yellow sign thrives where certainty falters. It flourishes where categories blur. It is not a closed idea, but an invitation to reinterpret. Within academic circles, particularly in the disciplines of literary theory, psychoanalysis, and post-structuralist philosophy, the yellow sign has found increasing resonance as a case study in what Jacques Derrida might call a supplement, a signifier whose meaning is always deferred, whose function is to unmake the very system it appears to support. Some scholars have compared the yellow sign to Lacan's real, that which resists symbolization absolutely, appearing in the psyche only through trauma or psychosis. The sign becomes, in this reading, a rupture in the symbolic order, its presence indicating the failure of language, narrative, and self-coherence. Under this lens, madness is not a descent, but a forced confrontation with the unmediated real. The sign does not mark danger. It marks the collapse of mediation. Digital humanities and media theory have likewise adopted the yellow sign, often metaphorically, as a stand-in for epistemic crisis in the internet age. Scholars analyzing creepypasta, ARGs, alternate reality games, and internet horror fiction have drawn explicit comparisons between the viral logic of the king in yellow and the mimetic structures that now define online storytelling. In these contexts, the yellow sign becomes not a piece of lore, but a narrative protocol, a way of constructing fiction that is fragmented, contagious, and structurally unstable. One notable example is the SCP Foundation, a collaborative fiction project that houses anomalies in a fictional bureaucratic institution. Several SCP entries reference the King in Yellow and symbols of uncertain origin that induce madness upon viewing. Here, the sign operates within a fictional science framework, a virus that infects description itself. In doing so, it reenacts its original literary function, contaminating the process of meaning-making. Subcultural appropriation has also taken on distinctly aesthetic and political dimensions. Within occult and left-hand path communities, particularly online, the yellow sign has been reinterpreted as a symbol of anti-dogmatic revelation. Some adopt it as a kind of anti-sigil, a gesture toward an ineffable truth that, once glimpsed, undoes all other truths. Unlike more traditional esoteric symbols, the yellow sign is prized precisely because it lacks history, lineage, or spiritual authority. It is not sacred. It is post-sacred. For these groups to adopt the yellow sign is to reject esotericism as hierarchy, embracing instead a vision of chaos not as evil, but as truth unshaped by human intention. It is a ritual without content, a belief in the corruption of belief itself. Even in more mainstream cultural movements, especially in digital art and fashion, the yellow sign has surfaced as a kind of aesthetic shorthand for dissociation and collapse. In vaporwave, dark academia, and analog horror aesthetics, one often finds visual nods to the sign. Not exact replicas, but symbols that resemble broken spirals, corrupted alphabets, or decayed heraldry. These appropriations are rarely conscious, yet the sign persists because it fits, a symbol for a time when certainty has collapsed, when narrative coherence has become optional. We must pause here and ask, does the yellow sign now function not as a story element, but as a condition? Is it now less a symbol within media and more a description of media, fragmented, looping, and destabilized? Consider carefully. The endurance of the yellow sign in these intellectual and subcultural spaces speaks not to its popularity, but to its relevance in the face of modern crises of meaning. In an era defined by simulation, disinformation, and the algorithmic erosion of linear narrative, the sign becomes increasingly plausible as a central metaphor. It does not require belief. It thrives on interpretation. It is not one thing, but the persistence of a question. In academia, it marks the limit of analysis. In subcultures, it marks a badge of affiliation with the unknowable. In both, it functions as a signpost for those who suspect that the world's surface has cracked and that something silent, recursive, and illegible is leaking through. The yellow sign is not merely a piece of literary ephemera. It has become something far more enduring and far more unsettling. As it passed from the pages of Chambers' The King in Yellow into the recursive networks of culture, philosophy, and psychology, the sign ceased to be a fictional object and began functioning instead as a philosophical condition, a reminder that meaning itself is fragile, contingent, and disturbingly porous. We must recognize that the sign's most lasting impact is not aesthetic, but epistemological. It does not horrify through violence or spectacle, but by revealing that the systems we rely on to distinguish reality from fiction, sanity from madness, self from story, may already be compromised. It does not threaten the body. It threatens the framework that allows us to interpret the body in the first place. In this light, the yellow sign becomes emblematic of what modern philosophers and theorists call ontological insecurity, the creeping awareness that reality may not be stable, that the narrative through which we perceive the world is vulnerable to collapse. The sign serves as a cipher for derealization, the psychological experience of the world losing its texture of reality. Those who see the yellow sign are not shown terrifying truths. They are shown that truth itself may be impossible. In the words of philosopher Eugene Thacker, horror is not the confrontation with fear, but the unhuman, and the sign, in its resistance to interpretation, becomes the unhuman embedded within language. It is not the content of the sign that destroys, It is its structureless structure, a refusal to obey the symbolic order we depend on to live. Consider how this logic aligns with increasing anxieties in our hyper-mediated era. The proliferation of deepfakes, AI-generated text, algorithmic personalization, and conflicting realities across news and social platforms has created a collective experience not unlike that of Chambers' cursed characters. The world remains legible, but only barely. The center holds, but not securely. The yellow sign, in this context, becomes a psychological metaphor for the collapse of ontological consensus. When characters in Chambers' stories realize they've read the forbidden play or seen the sign, they don't merely go mad. They lose the reference points that once organized their reality. So too do we, confronted by a world in which every image can be forged, every voice mimicked, every memory questioned. This points to an even more unsettling philosophical implication. The sign is not dangerous because it reveals something new, but because it renders everything already known suspect. It does not replace the world. It destabilizes the mechanism by which the world becomes coherent. This aligns with theories of epistemic nihilism, where knowledge itself is seen as inherently self-subverting. The yellow sign is a perfect emblem of this condition. A piece of information that cannot be known without undermining the knower. The cursed play, The King in Yellow, is said to reveal its true meaning in Act 2, yet none survive reading it. This is not just a narrative flourish. It is a metaphor for the impossibility of complete understanding. The sign is not a puzzle. It is a terminal point in the pursuit of meaning. We must pause here to reflect on the existential implications. If the yellow sign stands for the moment when the pursuit of truth collapses into absurdity, then it is also a commentary on the limits of human inquiry. Science, philosophy, religion, art, all are premised on the belief that reality is, at least in theory, decipherable. The sign offers no such comfort. It is not a veil over truth, but a tear in the fabric of truth itself. And yet, paradoxically, it compels attention. Those who glimpse it in stories or who discover it in dreams cannot look away. This mirrors the real-world compulsion toward the abyss, the magnetic pull of conspiracy theories, apocalyptic thinking, and nihilistic media. The sign becomes a stand-in for the desire to know what should not be known, and the human cost of pursuing that desire too far. Psychologically, the yellow sign operates as a symbolic trauma marker, a point beyond which narrative repair is no longer possible. In psychoanalytic terms, it might be likened to the primal scene or the moment of psychic rupture. Trauma theorists like Kathy Caruth argue that trauma is not the experience itself, but the inability to fully integrate that experience into narrative memory. The yellow sign behaves similarly. Once introduced, it retroactively alters the structure of perception. It does not add to experience, it breaks it. And in doing so, it reflects something deeply human. The knowledge that some wounds do not heal, some stories do not resolve, and some signs once seen can never be unseen. As we reach the end of this investigation, we must ask, has the yellow sign become real? Not as an object or symbol in the empirical sense, but as a persistent pattern in how we now tell stories, process reality, and understand the mind's limits. Its influence endures not because of textual fidelity or historical continuity, but because it articulates a truth we are only now beginning to fully grasp. That meaning is not guaranteed, that perception is vulnerable, and that to know is sometimes to destroy the very structure that makes knowing possible. The sign, in its final form, may not be a shape or a sound or a phrase. It may simply be a moment, a terrible moment, when the mind glimpses itself from the outside and understands with perfect clarity that nothing was ever stable to begin with.